Hello, my name is Nick Rizner. This is the Watchmen Companion Podcast presented by The Disorderly, and I'm very excited to do this one. Now, before I start, I should say this. This podcast will contain spoilers from the comics that this Watchmen series is based on. But I would imagine that the show would do the same thing, so that there's really no getting around it. And obviously, there will be spoilers for the show, since that's what this podcast is talking about, right? This is a companion podcast, so yes, this is also a spoiler review, if you want to look at it that way. And I'll just say this off the jump. I fucking loved episode 1, and my excitement for this show is as high as ever. Now, I love the Watchmen comic series. I love Damon Lindelof, specifically his work with The Leftovers, my favorite show, but also Lost. And this show is kind of a beautiful combination of both. You can see how this would be a natural progression of things from his work on Lost and then The Leftovers, and now this. It's a lot of comments on society. There's lots of philosophical debates to have. It's kind of a perfect sort of backdrop for another Lindelof show, another Lindelof universe. So let's get into the plot for this first episode. The show opens in 1921 during the infamous Tulsa race riot, which is said to be the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. Now, the scene focuses on a young black family, a mom, dad, and young son, maybe 5 years old, and they appear to be the owners of the local movie theater. Now, the first thing we see is the young boy watching a silent movie where a black stranger walks into an old western town and lynches the white sheriff for being a cattle thief. There's a bunch of foreshadowing there, but, we'll get to all that. The race riot is underway. There's a weird sort of parallel with three white men playing the piano out in the street, kind of a real-life version of what his mom was doing for the silent movie. But anyway, so they come out. There's literally planes dropping bombs. There are people being shot. There are white men with torches kind of poking and prodding, different black men in the streets. And this family is running through to try to get to some sort of safe house with a carriage that can take them away. Apparently there's no room, but what they do is they stow the boy in a little box. The next thing we see is the boy waking up in a field. The two people who are driving the carriage are dead, and there's a baby that the boy picks up. Still no answers as to who that baby is or how that ties in, but that is where we leave things with that 1921 scene. Then we flash forward to modern times where we see a country sort of hillbilly type guy driving a pickup truck and listening to rap music, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition. A black cop pulls him over, sees that he has a Rorschach mask in his glove compartment, and returns to his vehicle to request his firearm be released from its locked holster. So let's stop there for a second because they've already introduced a key detail about this world. For those who don't know, by the way, and it should be pretty obvious by now, but this show takes place in an alternate universe not unlike our own. In the Watchmen universe, Dr. Manhattan, a superhuman with incredible powers, joined forces with the U.S. government and helped them win a war in Vietnam. Now, the Watchmen comic book series came out in the mid to late 80s, so everything we're seeing in this show is well beyond that. Perceivably 2019, although I can't remember if it explicitly says it anywhere. But we're led to believe this is modern day, following the events of the book and the movie and all that. But back in the late 70s, something called the Keene Act made superheroes illegal. In other words, being a mass vigilante became, illegal. And Rorschach, one of the vigilantes at the time, one of the main ones, refused to acknowledge this law. He went on fighting crime illegally and ultimately died for his, sort of moral stubbornness, for lack of a better term. Well, apparently in this version of 2019, Rorschach's code of ethics has become a sort of calling card for young men in a group called the Cavalry, spelled with a K. The other key detail here concerns the police force. They're wearing masks, a measure to hide their identities and protect them from attacks on police officers. There's more information on that in a little bit. They also have more protocols in place to prevent police brutality. They need special permission to release their weapons. They have to record all their interactions on routine police stops. So that's worth taking note of. Now, I only mentioned the race of the characters in this traffic stop because race was immediately introduced as a subject with that Tulsa race riot opening. Right. So in that sense, you have a white man shooting a virtually unarmed black man, but the black man is the cop and the white man is the person being pulled over. So there seems to be a racial motive here, and we find out in a little bit that there definitely is. So moving on, let me say this. There's so many subtleties hidden in the first episode that make it very interesting to cover in a podcast capacity, but also incredibly challenging. So I'm starting with a plot recap, and then we'll sort of get into a deeper meaning what everything means. I'll sort of do that throughout the plot recap or whatever, but that's how a show like this is going to go, because it being a Lindelof story, it's going to be kind of all over the place, but ultimately, worth the journey. So that's what this podcast is attempting to do. But anyway, we have our first introduction to Police Chief Judd Crawford and Detective Lookingglass, played by Tim Blake Nelson, by the way, of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou fame, or I guess recently The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, that Netflix series. But yeah, Chief Crawford visits the injured police officer and then visits his wife to tell her that, everything will be okay. He also spends some time questioning whether he revealed his identity to anyone, which she says no. Now, a ton of information is revealed in this next scene. A lot of little tidbits. So first, the 24/7 news broadcast shows that Dr. Manhattan is on Mars, and he appears, at least in the footage, to be building cities out of sand or something along those lines. Then we meet Regina King, who says she was born in Vietnam a couple years before Vietnam became the 51st state. Yes, it appears Vietnam became a state after we dominated the war with the help of Dr. Manhattan. Also, Robert Redford is president, the actor Robert Redford. And there's even a poster in the children's classroom that depicts the four most important presidents in our country's history: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Richard Nixon, and Robert Redford. Redford apparently introduced a bill giving reparations to black people as well, which is kind of cutely called Redfordations. And finally, we hear about an event called the White Night. Apparently, police were attacked during this event, and this was back when they weren't allowed to wear masks. So after the attack, these people came to the house of Regina King and shot her. Now, I'm assuming this wasn't an isolated incident either because it changed the entire policy of the police force. Now they all wear masks, and now all of their identities are hidden, except, of course, for the police chief. No real clear answer on why that is. Oh, and the squids falling from the sky, that probably seemed very weird to those unfamiliar with the comics. Even if you've seen the movie, that might not have made sense to you because there are some discrepancies there, so let me explain. Basically, the central plot of Watchmen is that the superpowers of the world were at odds with each other, kind of like they are now. And the Adrian Veidt character decides that an outside enemy needed to be created to unite the people of Earth against it. In the movie, that outside enemy is Dr. Manhattan himself. Adrian Veidt basically exposes major cities to a ton of radiation, causing people to blame Dr. Manhattan and join forces against him. But apparently, Lindelof has elected to go with the alien story that they do in the book, and a fake alien attack is staged in the form of a giant squid created at Veidt's lab. That becomes the outside force that unites everyone, so these squid storms must be some sort of aftermath of all that. Back to the episode, though. We see that pagers are the most modern of technology. No cell phones. And blimps with speakers on them are used to promote things like television shows, by the way, including something called American Hero Story, Minutemen, which is about the original group of Watchmen superheroes from the 40s. We also see a newspaper headline declaring that Adrian Veidt is officially dead, which we know isn't true because we see him in the next scene. And just a little Easter egg, also featured in that edition of the paper is the Statue of Liberty closure due to KKK vandalism, and a story about a homeless camp being destroyed by the squid shower, leaving one dead. Kind of gives you a state of society in this world. Now, that paper is being read by an older black man who we later discover to be the same little boy from the opening scene. He's parked outside of Regina King's bakery, and he asks her if she thinks he can lift 200 pounds. Of course, he's talking about the dead body of Judd Crawford, who gets lynched later in the episode, but again, we'll get to all that later. The reason Regina King goes to the bakery in the first place is to get her disguise. She gets a message on her beeper that says Little Bighorn. Now, the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, is the battle where American forces were wiped out by the Native Americans. Those forces, by the way, were called the 7th Cavalry, which is obviously where the Rorschach mask people get the name for their organization. And the meaning of the message on the beeper was that the 7th Cavalry was back to their violent ways after what we find out was a 3-year hiatus. Turns out they're a bunch of racist right-wingers who want to drown the world in liberal tears and kill black people and race traitors, that's their words, not mine, by the masses. Now, the interesting political thing here is that Nixon is seen as sort of a hero to these people. They live in a place called Nixonville. They hate Robert Redford, who is, by all accounts, a liberal with the whole Redfordations and such. You can even see a "fuck Robert Redford" spray painted on a mobile home in Nixonville. And it would also make sense that these people would be Republicans, and Nixon was the last Republican president because, as we know, Redford has been president for, 5 terms or whatever? 30 years? I forget what the exact number was. But anyway, in response to this message by the 7th Cavalry, the police chief authorizes the release of weapons, to which Panda, the by-the-books guy, says he's making a mistake. The chief says, "Oh, well, it's my funeral." Another piece of foreshadowing. Oh, and that Latin phrase they call and respond to at the end of the meeting, it translates to the chief saying, "Who watches the Watchmen?" And the police officers respond in unison, "We do." Shout out to Bald Move Podcast for a perfectly titled podcast yet again. Check that out if you guys haven't already. And while we're on them, I'll give them full credit for calling out that, the little black boy from the beginning of the episode, he's actually Hooded Justice from the comics. We even see a commercial for that TV show where Hooded Justice is a feature part of it. But the little black boy that turns out to be the old black man in the wheelchair in present day, he is 100% Hooded Justice. I agree with that 100%. The ages check out. The costume makes perfect sense with the noose around the neck and the motive sort of mirroring that of the silent film the boy was watching at the beginning. It all checks out. By the way, Regina King's alter ego is Sister Night. I've got to start calling her that. I can't keep calling her Regina King because that's obviously the actress's name, not the character. So, let's start now. Sister Night kicks some guy's door in and takes him to the station. He gets interrogated by Looking Glass in this weird futuristic pod with a 360-degree screen showing provocative images, specifically racial stuff. LG asked the guy a number of questions, but they're really just looking to see if he has any physical responses to the imagery, and it turns out that he does. Sister Night then basically beats the shit out of him until he reveals that the cavalry activity is going down at the cattle ranch. Well, it turns out the cavalry was prepared for this attack because they're armed with heavy machinery. They all have suicide pills ready to swallow if they're captured by the police, so they, are prepared to die in order to keep their plans a secret. And all we know is that these plans involve collecting lithium batteries from a bunch of old watches. Oh, and they have a, quote, fucking plane, in the words of Pirate Jenny, another cop that works dispatch. Well, the plane is ultimately flamethrowered out of the sky by the police version of the Night Owl's aircraft, another reference to the comics. Cut to the dinner party with Sister Night and Judd Crawford, along with their spouses and children. Lots and lots and lots of clock references here. While Judd is singing that show tune from Oklahoma, you can literally hear a ticking clock in the background. Also, the overhead shot of the dinner table looks like the inner workings of a clock. Anyway, after dinner, Crawford gets a message on his beeper. Now, he tells his wife that the message is about the cop who was shot. Apparently, it's a message from the hospital. The cop was awake, and Judd decides to put on his uniform, drive down to the hospital, and see him. But before he gets there, his truck is disabled by a spike strip, and a flashing strobe light is flashed in his face. Sister Night then gets a mysterious call telling her to come to the old oak tree, where she sees the same old man, who is also the young boy from the beginning of the episode, in his wheelchair next to a hanging body, and that body belongs to Chief Judd Crawford. Now, it's worth noting that they literally show us the beeper when it says Little Bighorn, and you can see that message come in. The show does not show the beeper when Judd Crawford, allegedly gets the message that the guy from the hospital was awake. Is that a coincidence? Was that intentional? Was the message really from someone else? I don't know. Really no way of knowing right now. We could never return to that, but this could be a type of thing where it was intentionally left off, and if it was intentional, then there's probably some hidden information there. But in a seemingly separate story arc, at least for the time being, we see Adrian Veidt, a much older version than we're used to in the 80s, of course, and he lives in an isolated mansion surrounded by what has to be robots, right? I mean, he's a watchmaker. He's the smartest man in the world. It would follow then that he has a staff of super advanced robots that he's created, but they're not quite perfect, as you can see from the offering of a horseshoe instead of a knife to cut the cake. And the gross taste of the cake in general, like obviously they're not quite, perfect replicas of humans. You can see that Adrian's disappointed, by the way, not with his servant, but with himself for making an imperfect creation, which, that all trends with this character. Also, what is he celebrating? The anniversary of what exactly? Was it the anniversary of a successful, fake alien invasion? What is this celebration? I don't know. But if I know Adrian as well as I think I do, he's definitely not up there writing a play. He's hatching a scheme. Now, the watchmaker's son, the supposed name of the play, is a clear reference to Dr. Manhattan, because as the story goes, Dr. Manhattan was a simple watchmaker's son prior to being turned into a superhuman, so clearly the scheme, involves Dr. Manhattan in some capacity. Now, I almost wonder if this thing is setting up to conclude like the movie did, and I kind of hope not, only because I want something new, but it certainly seems like that would fit, right? So the comics end with the alien invasion thing, but couldn't this be an attempt by the 7th Cavalry to use all that lithium to create radiation bombs to get people sick, a cancer bomb like Judd kind of alluded to at the end of this episode? Because that would be just like the movie ending. And if Adrian sees all this happening because he's the world's smartest man and he can kind of see these patterns and trends develop before anything actually happens, couldn't his plan be to bring Dr. Manhattan to take the blame for these radiation bombs and use him as a sort of patsy to basically stop an all-out race war? I wonder. And by the way, we didn't really mention him, but Red Scare seems to be another key member of the police super detective team. So you've got Sister Night, Looking Glass, and Red Scare, and possibly Pirate Jenny, because she has a name and some lines in this episode, although we haven't seen much out of her. Oh, and of course, that stubborn administrative cop named Panda. I'm sure he'll keep coming into play. Now, I'll just say this. A lot is revealed in the upcoming episode's preview after the credits. I know a lot of people don't want to know all of that info, so I won't talk about it in the podcast, but if you're looking for it, you should watch that and start to draw your own conclusions. I'd be happy to discuss any theories if you want to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Nick Rizner, Nickrizner, and my DMs are open. But that'll wrap the first episode of this podcast. And again, I'm extremely excited for what's to come. Extremely excited. I had seen the Watchmen movie a while back, but I specifically bought the graphic novel after it was first announced that this would be Lindelof's next project. That's how much I love Damon Lindelof and how excited I was for this show. And then after reading Watchmen, that excitement grew even more. And after seeing the first episode, I'm confident that this show is going to deliver on all that excitement. So tune in each and every week, and I'll do my best to break things down for you guys. You know it's going to be complicated. Any Lindelof show is. Also, really do. You should check out Bald Move's podcast entitled We Do. That's my favorite companion show. For any show you like, I always seek out and religiously listen to the Bald Move companion for it. I just love their spin on things. Jim and Aaron are great at what they do, so check that out. Otherwise, please head to thedisorderly.com for the best in sports and entertainment, mostly entertainment these days, if we're being honest, where David St. Martin and Andrew Volpe are doing a ton of great movie reviews, most recently The Joker, It Chapter 2, a couple kind of creepy, spooky movies for the Halloween time. But that will do it for Watchmen Episode 1. Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week, and until then, I'm out. Peace.